Welcome to our talk, Collaborating Across Disciplinary Lines. We'd like to introduce the methodology we use in our project, generating a framework for out-of-field teachers in different discipline areas. Our presentation will be a compilation of our reflections. Just a slide that begins with teaching out of field as an issue that very much centres on that disciplinary divide, especially at that secondary level. And when you're thinking about out of field as being related to the subject you're teaching rather than the year level that you're teaching. And so you can think about it in terms of subject specific teaching, the way we teach, but also there's translatable parts of our teaching that we can move from one subject to another and we translate it. But there's some things that are transferable that you can plant from one location to another without changing it all. And then there's other things that are quite specific to other subjects that can't be translated. Moving into our actual focus, we are generating a framework of subject-specific expertise for out-of-field teachers that is translatable across disciplines. So the first one is what's core to teaching a subject and what's subject-specific and what's generic. The next one is how does the experience of teaching out-of-field in one subject differ to teaching out-of-field in another?
I suppose some of the very early discussions as a group raised my awareness of the different types of subject-specific understanding. So when others have talked, you sort of start to get an understanding of the nuances that exist between different subjects.
Is something that was common about the sort of engagement with networks and sort of communities of practice and engaging with sort of expert others? Was that part of what helped those who do experience teaching out of field and find ways to kind of overcome and manage it?
So in thinking about what's core to the notion of subject specific, you need to look at the experience of it, recognising that experience is subject to the disciplinary ways of knowing, doing and being, and then how does this relate to the subject expertise needed? That's all part of
what's core to teaching a subject. Yeah.
I mean, as I'm looking at these, I just keep thinking about this is the example that I have in my head, that if you teach English at secondary, you're expected to be a writer and a reader yourself, you know, participating in writing and reading communities of practice and broader cultures and things like that in a way that a science teacher is not actually expected to be. And to be able to do those sorts of things, to know about, you know, what's on at the Victorian Writers' Festival and to participate in it and to know about all the latest books that have been published and all that kind of thing, you need particular kind of expertise, which is different from, I think, a science teacher.
Teachers are coming from, you know, English or whatever to teach in a science classroom. They're going to bring different attitudes or different ways of seeing and knowing. And that's basically what we're talking about when we're talking about what's core to teaching a subject.
Now to sort of shift your focus towards the methodology that we're using, which is around collaboration and disciplinary research. One is collaborative and interdisciplinary research.
I think really it's just about being able to achieve something together that couldn't be achieved individually. That's my main understanding, and that's how I've used it in my interdisciplinary research, you know, between medicine and education.
Then you've got the theory of collaborative advantage by Huxson, which is that practice-oriented theory. It's focusing on practical understanding that arises as a result of that working across disciplines. And then boundary crossing enables looking at the nature of the boundary crossing itself and the mechanisms that can support that boundary crossing. And so what these theories are enabling us to do is to be able to focus on what arises as a result of us working together, of sharing our own disciplines, and then working out a common language on what is useful for comparing.
We could argue that it actually also reflects what the out-of-field teacher experiences. They're having to meld disciplines themselves. So it makes sense to be echoing that in the kind of research that we're doing.
When you consider that at higher education, we're being asked to collaborate in interdisciplinary ways with people from other faculties and clearly other disciplines, because there's a recognised advantage in doing that in terms of the richness of the outcomes of the projects and the research that you undertake.
The other one that we've just come across, Chris and I, is something called collaborative ideation. Through that ideation process, we've been able to cross boundaries and understand a little bit about the others, and or at least have a glimpse of others. We appreciate the collaborative advantage as a result of meeting and coming together through that dialogue between the different disciplinary experts. And then we use Signature Pedagogies by Schulman as the basis of our collaboration. Schulman proposed that there were surface, deep and implicit structures of signature pedagogies, surface being the concrete operational acts of teaching and learning, the deep structure referring to the set of assumptions about how best to impart a certain body of knowledge and know-how, and then the implicit structure, which is a moral dimension that comprises a set of beliefs about professional attitudes, values and dispositions. We particularly focused on the learning intentions of thinking, performing and acting, which have become popularised in education as knowing, doing and being. We're working on the idea that teachers are basically enculturating students into disciplinary ways of knowing, doing and being as they're teaching. But at the same time, out-of-field teachers need to become familiar with those ways of knowing, doing and being as well. So what we've set out to do is to identify those disciplinary ways of knowing, doing and being that are then translated into school subjects. So beginning with, what do we mean by discipline?
One of the things I found was there wasn't a really clear definition of what discipline was. Discipline itself referred to a branch of academic study which usually took place in universities and consisted of theoretical backgrounds, etc., whereas subject refers to a branch of knowledge studied generally in schools. The Freya model actually did try and define what discipline was, and it gave some inclusion and exclusion criteria. I then had a look at Schwab, which is structure of knowledge in the curriculum. And he actually looks about the structure of the disciplines and how it's through the limiting or distorting lenses of these bodies of knowledge, of the bodies of thinking in the disciplines that we tend to look at things. But one of the things that really came from Schwab's book that I really liked was to know what structures underlie a given body of knowledge is to know what problems we shall face in imparting this knowledge.
For me, that really resonates with what I've read, being able to recognise and understand what the distinctive core of your discipline is. And once you know what that is in terms of, you know, ways of knowing and ways of doing, then you look for that sort of in the syllabus and curriculum structures, and then you also look for that in your pedagogical practice, and then working through that to try and find it in an area that you're coming to as a teacher that you may not be familiar with.
Yeah, in terms of the structure, absolutely. This idea of, for science and particularly for chemistry, you know, research for decades now is focused on how to structure chemistry knowledge. So chemistry educators first figuring out how to structure what is the observable, what is the unobservable, how do we represent the invisible, you know, dealing with submicroscopic levels of matter when we can't see it. And so using the language of chemistry, the language of science to describe it. An out-of-field teacher, that will be, they might have a handle on how to engage students through science, how to motivate students and do the practical activity, but they won't be able to dive into or use the language of chemistry to describe the things that they can't see, the unobservable, because they haven't dealt with first the structure.
I just think we need to also keep in mind all the time the notion that these structures are constantly changing and being contested. Just look at what's happening with the history curriculum in the media at the moment. And for us with phonics in the English curriculum, you know, just the incredible amount of disruption and change and everything that's going on, in part for me is a really problematic word, because that's not my epistemological understanding. And I also think this is a good example of how we're each bringing our own disciplinary and theoretical framing. So within English, I would be teaching a post-structuralist reader response kind of way of analysing text.
So in science, it's about there is a natural phenomenon there which is to be understood, and we have ways of thinking about that have developed over a long period of time. Whereas English is, I think, much more around discourse, where you've got this contestation of ideas and ways of communicating those, which is not about understanding a phenomenon in a particular way.
What I was thinking about though was, imagine a teacher coming from sort of an Englishy kind of discipline and having to go and teach in science, or coming from science and having to teach in English. You're in such different paradigms. I think this is one of the key differences really between the humanities or the creative arts certainly, and the sciences. We want something different. So we're not imparting, if anything, we're, I suppose, eliciting, but we're also inspiring.
I guess what we've just illustrated is the methodology that we've been taking. So we've been looking at what is common to teaching out of field across the disciplines. How does looking across the disciplines deepen our thinking of teaching in an out of field context? What value is there in having a framework that provides a comparative lens for teachers and researchers, and what might be included in such a framework? And with that one, you're looking at, what are those salient elements?
I think the second one, I think that's coming about through the conversations we're having, helps us deepen our thinking of out of field contexts.
And I think it helps to develop our own understanding as well of our own discipline.
Yeah.
Because it's through looking at that comparative lens that you notice things that you may not have noticed before.
Yeah, and it also enhances our ability to empathise with out of field teachers, especially for those of us who haven't specifically done research in this area, so we can't call on what our participants have said. Maybe to add, Linda, something about, and thinking sort of in a self-reflexively critical kind of way, what are the limitations, the potential limitations of such a framework too?
So our general methodological steps have been, we've spent a lot of our time developing this proposed framework. Then we're going to be interviewing experts and refine the framework after that. And then the process of developing the framework has involved identifying useful theories. And then we had that collaborative discussion and documenting of key ideas relating to elements that could go into a framework. And we started off with these 4 ideas. We handed it over to Jared to identify some key elements of the disciplines that we could use for comparison.
And I think the approach that I took was taking those bullet points and something that, and I put it through my science way of thinking and my very PCK way of thinking about teaching and out of field teaching. And there was in those subsequent meetings after that, where particularly people that are outside of physics and chemistry and science in general sort of challenged the way that I put some of those ideas together, which was a great way to sort of take these ideas forward around what was, trying to draw out those things that are going to be salient across. One of the examples that I keep coming back to in my own thinking was around the misconceptions and alternate conceptions. It's not really a thing. But when you sort of peel that back and go back like a meta layer, it's more about barriers to progression of learning and how all sorts of subjects and disciplines will have some sort of a barrier to a progression. But in different disciplines, we'll conceptualize that in a different way.
But then what I think had been useful for me was working at which of these variety of things are actually salient. And then that brought us to our model, where we worked out which of those elements we think are critical. So what is distinctive about the subjects, and what do out of field teachers need to know, do and be? So we have the disciplinary ideas on the left and right, and then we have the school versions of those in the red, and they're all tied to that notion of teacher subject identity. And they all sit within the content, knowledge and curriculum. And then outside of that is that broader context, which we talked about as being contested and changing both within schools, but also within the disciplines themselves.
Being out of field as a researcher, doing out of field research has been quite interesting.